Bob, thank you so much for joining me. I wonder if to kick off, you could introduce who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so my name is Rob Briner. I am a Professor of Organisational Psychology at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm also Director of Research at the Corporate Research Forum. So I have a kind of partly academic job, but partly a job working with HR practitioners as well.
Now, not only have you been on the podcast before, sort of talking about
I have.
evidence-led work, but
Mm.
but um, you're one of my favourite follows on LinkedIn, and I've linked to you on
Oh,
the
thank
top
you.
of the show notes, largely because you feel to me like you play the role of the kid sitting at the back of the classroom saying, "I'm not sure there's any proof for that." You've got to me, you've got this compelling ability to ask us to check the facts of what we're being told. Is that how you see your role? Is that how you see your sort of role as sort of the the,
Yeah.
the troublesome challenger?
Well, I happened to be doing things, and then people told me, like you, well, that's what you're doing, and that's what I realised I was doing. And I kind of thought, well, doesn't everybody do that? And I realized after some time, no, everybody doesn't do it. It reminds me a bit, it's a bit like maybe the kid at the back of the class, or it reminds me, of course, of the emperor's new clothes. So everyone's saying, aren't the emperor's clothes beautiful? They're lovely, aren't they great? And the kid's going, but the emperor isn't wearing any clothes. So I see a lot of naked emperors, and I see a lot of people saying how beautiful the clothes are. And I suppose, yes, it's not even necessarily consciously what I'm trying to do, but it turns out that's what I am doing. And I think it's because I generally hope everyone's doing this, but as I say, apparently they are not.
What do you think the origin of your cynicism? What do you think the origin of your skepticism is?
Yeah, well, I'm glad I'm definitely skeptical, not cynical, because a lot of what I do is not driven by the idea people don't want to do good and want to help. I think people do want to do good and want to help. So the skepticism, though, is about saying what you're often trying to do. I don't think is necessarily kind of very useful. And I guess what it's driven by in a way is a number of things. I think it's things like waste. So I see businesses and organizations and individuals within them just wasting a lot of time and effort on energy on things that just aren't very effective or maybe are even quite harmful. And I find that sort of irritating. It's an irritating thing, like the kid saying the emperor's got new clothes. The kid gets irritated because everyone's saying they can see something the kid thinks isn't there. So I think it comes a bit from the waste, but it also comes from, and this is why it's not skeptical, so not cynical, I think it's skeptical, is that I think organizations and businesses could be doing so much better. And I'm sure you'd agree, they could manage people, they could manage businesses, they could be much more effective if they got rid of some of this stuff that just isn't helping very much. So it's driven, I think, by that. I think by A, it's a waste. B, I think organizations just could be doing so much better than they are.
Yeah, so as someone who comes across your posts pretty frequently, actually, I think because I sort of tend to like all of them. You've taken on some of the big topics. I just wonder if we could do a
Mm,
sort of a fun a little run through some of the
sure.
not necessarily fads, but terms we've pushed back on. The first one is the idea of workplace engagement. I wonder if you could sort of talk about whether that's a helpful term. I've seen you
Sure.
sort of talk about the challenge of trying to categorize that.
Yeah, so my engagement with engagement has actually been quite long term. So I think I first got interested, I think we're probably past peak engagement now, but it's kind of plateaued into a very common practice that lots of organizations appear to get involved with. And when it first appeared and got popular, I guess the issues I had with it were manifold, but I think the most important ones are firstly, this whole issue, what on earth do we mean by engagement? And, I've had the experience, I'm sure many of us have. If you ask organizations, HR managers to tell you what they mean, they don't really know, or they give you multiple different definitions, or the definitions they give you is nothing to do with the engagement survey that they use every 6 months, every year, every month, or whatever. So people very, they have multiple different definitions. The thing they're measuring with it doesn't seem to often coincide with what they think it is. So the first fundamental problem, from an evidence-based practice perspective is, can you define what it is you're trying to affect or understand? And are you measuring it in a way that's consistent with that? That's one thing. The second issue is that, broadly speaking, measures of engagement correlate really highly with standard, almost 100-year-old now, measures of job satisfaction. So there's an issue there. They're not measuring anything new. But what it also means is we can look at some of that job satisfaction literature. If they overlap hugely, which they do seem to, is job satisfaction particularly relevant for job performance? And the answer is not really. So the search for the link between job satisfaction and job performance has been described for decades in the scientific literature as the holy grail, something really desirable, but it's actually very hard to find in terms of the research we conduct. Now, of course, some people are probably thinking now, well, sure, if someone's really, really satisfied, won't they perform better than someone who isn't? Well, no, they might be too satisfied. They might be just complacent. They might love work and not be performing well. Similarly, someone who's not satisfied may be doing a fantastically good job. So a lot of assumptions there about it, and people often talk about extremes. If someone's really unhappy, then they won't perform well. Well, maybe. If someone's really happy, then they will. Well, maybe. But that's not what this is about. There isn't actually, doesn't appear to be a very general or strong relationship between those two things. So in the case of engagement, going back to that, people are happily and merrily investing, again, going back to waste, a lot of time and energy, measuring engagement, looking at scores, poring over spreadsheets, where on a 7-point scale, it's gone from 3.5 to 3.7, double thumbs up for that, or it's gone down from 4.6 to 4.3. Oh my God, what's going wrong? These things on the whole probably don't really matter much, if at all, for performance. Add to that, most organizations that I certainly work with rarely check that their measures of engagement actually predict anything important for the business. There's an assumption they do, it is rarely checked. And again, if you look at the scientific evidence, I would say there's almost not, well, it's not a particularly strong link between those two things. Or to flip the whole thing another way, if your goal is to increase performance, focusing on engagement is a very bizarre thing to do,
Right.
given all the other things that might affect performance.
So job performance might be one thing that you measure. What else would you measure if you were going to do something that's slightly more meaningful? It's slightly more predictive.
Well, I wouldn't measure anything, because I think
You wouldn't
this is
measure
again one of the
anything.
tendencies. Well, it depends what the issue is. I think you have to start with a business problem, start with an organizational issue. So I think underlying what you're saying there, Bruce, is there is an assumption that we should measure stuff in employees. My question is, well, why? Why? Maybe you want to, maybe you need to, maybe it's important, but it shouldn't be a routine thing we do. We should think about what the organizational business is trying to do, what we want to do, and then try and make sure we're putting things in place that will help to do that. It may be somewhere along the line, a measurement thing comes up, but it also may be it's not particularly important or relevant. So I think behind your question is, what's the alternative to engagement? The answer is, well, there isn't one, because engagement's not particularly useful. But what is useful is going back to say, what are we trying to do as a business? That's a useful starting point.
Got it. So if someone said, I'm going to set about trying to measure the retention of customers or the happiness of customers or whether people leave our business satisfied,
Yeah,
those things might be measurable
they
things because they're about
absolutely. Yeah,
business
yeah.
objectives, but they're not necessarily going to be focused on what the employees
That's right. In
are
general,
experiencing.
customer retention could be a very important thing for a business. For another business, it might not be that important. For most businesses, it is. Similarly, if you get customers, that's new customers, that's also quite important. However, suppose 80% of the new customers you get leave within 6 months, then that's not really very good. So even measures you think are good and obviously good, it still is very contextual. What are you measuring? What is it telling you? Is it linked to business performance? So in some kinds of businesses where you may be losing customers, it doesn't matter if you'll regain those customers overnight. So again, it sort of depends.
Got it. Because a lot of businesses measure employee attrition, like the quit
Yeah.
rate, and that
Yeah.
seems like to be quite a helpful thing to measure from my perspective. Do you not see that
Yeah.
as helpful?
I think it can be. It so again comes back to the point: who is quitting? Uh, how in what kind of roles? How easy or cheap is it to replace them? As a very vague indicator, it's worth it. It's something you measure might tell you there's something worth looking at. But again, it depends crucially who is quitting, why they're quitting, if your level of quit is higher or lower than organizations you can really compare yourself to. So simply, again, having a dashboard where these things go up and down is only vaguely kind of indicative. But in the case, I think, of quitting and attrition, yeah, there's often a cost associated with that. But I would say it still depends on who is quitting. So if people in absolutely key roles are quitting, that's disastrous. If it's people who are quitting because maybe, you can replace them again fairly quickly, or they're quitting for other sorts of reasons, maybe that's fine. It's just a normal thing you have to cope with as a business.
Got it. I'm just so informed by the work of Zeynep Tan, and Zeynep Tan sort of initially started working in retail stores, but she says that the one thing that is ruinous for any sort of experience of work is if your organisation is carrying a very high attrition rate, because it kills productivity and it ruins the experience of work for a lot of people. But I hear your point.
It
That
might,
might be.
yeah. Well, I've been some meta-analyses looking at quit rates, attrition rates in businesses and trying to connect that to business performance. And again, some studies showed there might be a link. Other studies showed there's not a particular link. That may be, obviously, in some context supported, but in other contexts, it doesn't seem to matter very much. So I still think it depends. I think the idea we can look at one thing or another thing, saying that is an indicator of something great or terrible, is probably not very wise unless you could link it to actual business performance of the things you're trying to do.
So we've put across through engagement. I'd love you to talk about psychological safety, and this is probably one of the things that I was. I saw a long post by you, psychological safety. Is it even a thing? Was but psychological safety has sort of probably been the most cited idea in this work, and I'd love to know. You appear to have an objection with it, and
I don't have an objection with it. I love it. I love the idea of
okay,
psychological safety. So it's not about whether I like it or not. It's totally irrelevant. The question is it a useful and helpful concept for organizations and businesses? That's the key. That's what I'm asking. So not if it's useful, whether I like it. Sorry, not whether I like it. So yes, it's called, is this the thing? So there is this thing. I think I've done about 8 or 9 now of these where I tried to look
yeah,
at the kind of logic and theory and evidence behind quite popular concepts. And I did this as part of the Work Psychology Network, which is set up at the Corporate Research Forum, which is trying to look at theory and evidence from work psychology and how it's used or misused kind of in the workplace. And yes, I chose psychological safety, which is a very common, very popular thing. So the questions I would always ask about this is, can you define it? And again, there's a lot of question marks over actually how you define it. And one of the challenges here is that people kind of instantly, they know what it means. They feel it. It's very intuitive. Oh, yes, I get it. Well, do you? Do you actually get it? Or is it just, what is it you're getting? Are we all getting different things? So because it's intuitive and instant, that's a big red flag for me, normally with most kind of constructs. So can you define it? Yes, to some extent, but again, the definitions are rather different. Secondly, can you measure it or assess it? And there are, again, questions over the validity, reliability of the measures, even some of the quite popular ones. And again, if you look at the actual items in those measures, it's often quite hard to link it back to the definition. So you're measuring something potentially, but what it is it a little unclear. So a bit hard to define sometimes, a bit hard to measure sometimes. There's debates about the measures. But the key thing is does it predict anything important? So you can measure this stuff back to engagement. There's no point in measuring it unless it's telling you something important. The challenge here scientifically is there just are not many longitudinal studies looking at where if engagement, psychological safety goes up, whether it has these outcomes, or where the psychological safety goes down, it has other kind of outcomes. So we just don't know too much about it. And I think psychological safety is an example of maybe, if I wrote the same thing in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, it might look very different. So I'm just talking about what it appears we know at the moment, what seems the case at the moment. So is this idea, is there a cause and effect thing? And the trickiest thing of all about all this is, can you actually intervene? Can you do something to increase psychological safety? And again, there's very little data and evidence about that. So even if it does link longitudinally to something kind of important, we don't know much yet about how you can increase it. The challenge, therefore, I think about like a lot of these concepts in the Is This a Thing series, is people are seeing an idea like psychological safety and they grab it and say, can we use this thing to help us? And again, my question was, but what are you trying to do? What are you trying to do? Not, is there a thing out there you could use that might be useful? It seems to be working completely backwards. What are you trying to achieve? And a lot of these concepts like culture change or engagement or attitude, they're starting with a thing and then trying to work out if it's useful instead of saying, do we actually understand what the issue is? So maybe in some context, psychological safety is very important and it links to important things and you can actually do something to improve psychological safety. That may be the case, but it also may be the case to a huge number of other contexts where it just doesn't really matter very much. But you have to start off with what is it you're trying to do. Psychological safety may be the intervention you want. It may not. It may be something totally different, depending on what you're trying to achieve.
But you've got a leader here, and a leader has just done sort of an internal piece of work, and maybe it says we've been tolerating bad behaviour inside the organisation, or that,
Sure.
some sort of bullying or something has come to light.
Yeah.
And the leader says, look, our objective for the next year is we want to build a psychologically safe environment. We want to have a place where people can speak up. We're not going to have those domineering characters displacing things. All that being said, then what would you advise them to do? That's their goal. It's quite a noble objective they're trying to do.
Mm.
You've said, look, I want you to tell me what you're trying to do. So how would you achieve that goal, even if the concept is a difficult one to measure? What actions would you take in that situation?
Well, the first, I think, is to understand the specific behaviours you're talking about. So you said people are bullying, people are unpleasant. There's been some incidents of people feel like they can't speak up. Well, are they related or they're not related? People could be horrible and mean, but people still speak up. So they're not the same thing. One doesn't necessarily affect the other, but they might. If, for example, you're interested in specific behaviours, so again, we did a report on behaviour change in organisations. The first thing you need to focus on, understand, is what are the specific behaviours you're trying to change, number one. And secondly, what's the incidence and frequency of those sorts of behaviours? And typically, if you look across lots of organisations, it may be psychological safety they turn to, but often what they turn to is culture. So time and time again, you've seen various reports, for example, from police services, from the Grenfell Tower disaster in the UK, from other kind of incidents. People see, to your point, bullying, what this is bullying and negative behaviour, and they say we must change the culture. And typically, I don't think that works at all. It's not clear what people are trying to change. So the starting point is, if you think there are some behaviours which you want to change, fairly obviously, you've got to understand what those behaviours are, again, the incidence, the frequency, where they're happening. That's the most important starting point.
So I was going to come on to, like, if we've gone through engagement, we've gone through psychological safety. I was going to ask you about culture next, and I've seen you write a lot talking about sort of whether culture, with talking about the climate, whether we're talking about behaviour. Could you break down your frustration then when people talk about culture, and how are you how would you tackle something as holistic then as the idea of culture, as sort of far reaching as the culture in the NHS or the culture in the police?
This is I think you just identified one of the key problems. All encompassing, holistic. It's everything, isn't it? It's everything, and you can't tackle something that's everything. It's just impossible. You can't do it. It can't be done. So that gives you an important clue about some of the, I think, the main issues. I think more of the culture,
But really,
culture change idea.
Is that true? I mean, I get
Yeah,
it.
of course
And I
it's true.
get
Of course, it's
no,
like
but
saying
I get that you're sort of the contrarian voice who's pushing back, but let's look specifically at some of the issues in the police. An issue where WhatsApp groups were openly sort of undermining the authority. There was a sense of they were tolerating things that there was almost like a counterculture within the organisation, just tolerating bad behaviour. Or in the NHS one recently, the Nottingham report, senior leaders, for whatever reason, weren't participating in the exploration of wrongdoing. So I get you could say, I get you can say, well, this is not just a campaign. This is not just posters on the wall. It's not just one person standing up. But I just don't fully buy that you cannot re-engineer an organization to eliminate certain behaviors. And I get it. I get that, standing up and saying this is difficult, or beware of simple answers to complicated problems. But I just don't fully buy that being cynical about things gives you a pass, and that sort of is the solution.
So, can you repeat that question, Bruce? What's the question?
Yes. Yeah, specifically, you seem to be suggesting that you cannot change
I'm
culture within the police.
No, I'm suggesting the absolute opposite. I'm suggesting you absolutely can change. Okay, it's really important, Bruce. I'm not saying you can't change behaviour. There's hundreds of years of theory and evidence and data that you absolutely can. So I have no doubt about that. So let's just dispel that. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is culture is not a good route to doing that.
Right.
It's not a good way to do it. In fact, it's a very poor way to do it. So I agree with the objective. Let's say we have, and it doesn't happen much, but let's say we have got good measures and good assessments of these behaviours. I totally agree. They are things we want to change. My question is, what is the most effective way of changing them? And
Got
from
it.
my understanding is culture is pretty useless. And I'll tell you some of the reasons why. You actually mentioned one of the problems that we talked about kind of counterculture. One thing is, so people assume organizations have a culture. That is highly contentious. Because it's making assumptions. We feel we can see the culture. You go to a new workplace, you go to a new office, you say, I can feel this culture. The amount of data you have about that organization is minuscule. So you're not in a position really to judge it. But I guess, as you know, cognitive biases, we want to see patterns and things that are consistent in the world around us. We think kind of may help us make sense of it. It's kind of a bit ridiculous. It's a bit like going to the north of England and saying, oh, I went to Sheffield, where I lived for 6 years. Oh, everybody was really friendly. It's a really friendly culture. It's just nuts. Where, how can you possibly have enough data to make that kind of judgment? Are there norms of behaviour? Sure. But then, like your example, the WhatsApp group in the Metropolitan Police, the question is, how many people are doing that? Is it shared? Is it not shared? What actually is the problem with that? So the first issue around culture is there a culture? And people never really ask that question. They just assume, oh, you just can feel it, just a vibe, you can sense it. No, you can't.
But is there not, your whole point quite frequently is, demanding a specificity of definition, saying, look, well, rather than sort of being non-specific about what you mean,
Yeah.
but could we not define culture as the norms of behaviour?
You can, but then you're not
organisation?
absolutely. That's exactly what I'll go on to. That's exactly my next point. So the next point is culture often defined as the way we do things around here. Right? What's the way we do things around here? It's behaviour. So you get into the bizarre situation. You say, let's change the way we do things around here to change the way we do things around here. It's entirely circular. You want to get away from the way we do things around here to what are the specific behaviours you're trying to change. Because again, the way we do things around here is assuming there's a series of norms that may be, but there also may not be. Let's go back to the Metropolitan Police. I don't think the way that group was behaving, as you yourself pointed out, was a norm in the whole of Metropolitan Police. It was some groups of people, as far as we can tell. So again, it isn't the way we do things, right? This is the way some people do things around here, the way other people do. So there's different sort of things going on. So it's very, very kind of circular. And typically, culture actually describes behavior. It doesn't cause it. So when people talk about, I can feel a culture, I can see behavioral norms. Behavioral norms are a description of behavior. They're not necessarily the cause of it. And even as you say, and I agree with you, norms of behavior might affect other people's behavior, or when you observe those norms, that is absolutely the case. But the key thing is you still then need to change the behavior. So if there's a group of people behaving in a way, and maybe there is a norm for that behavior, what you need to do still, let's just put culture out of the picture and say we still need to change those behaviors. Then that's the real question is, how do we change behavior? And as I say, there's hundreds of years of research into this in many different kinds of fields, from psychology, from health psychology to social policy, which is almost never used in organizations.
Got it. So when I use the definition of culture, which is the behaviour inside an organisation where they're encouraged, rewarded, or tolerated, I guess what you're saying is it's too oblique to talk about that for that. And actually, if we want to change the behaviour inside an organisation, let's specifically target the behaviours inside the organisation. Is
Yeah,
that what you're
exactly.
saying?
Yeah, and your point about the specific behaviours that are rewarded or tolerated, well, hold on a minute. It's ambiguous. There's people behaving badly getting rewarded. There's other people behaving well also getting rewarded. It's not that straightforward. Organizations are quite complicated, particularly larger ones. There's different things going on. So I think there's some rewards going on here, there's some punishments going on here, there's other things going on there, but it's not this monolithic single thing. I think it's absolutely not. There might be subcultures and other kinds of things, as you said, but it's not a single thing. But exactly, the point is, you need to target the behaviour. If you were I'll give you an example that I did in the behaviour change report. If you wanted, say, your mate said, I want to get fit, I want to go to the gym more often. You want to say, well, what we need to do, we need to change the culture about, or your attitudes about the way you think about going to the gym. We need to really work on that and change the way you think about it, your norms. No, you just help them go to the gym. You say, let's go to the gym. I'll come with you tomorrow. We'll go at 2:00. We'll just go for half an hour. We'll do these kind of things. I'll come with you, and then we'll do it again at the end of the week, and then we'll do it again in the week. And through that process of doing it, it wouldn't necessarily work, but it's more likely your mate will learn that going to the gym is not a bad thing. They will change their attitudes towards it. And again, typically, attitudes are often regarded as a consequence of behavior within
Right.
psychology. Whereas often organizations' attitudes are seen as a cause of behavior, particularly they're not. It's usually kind of the other way around. So to change behavior, you actually have to change the environment. And it is a bit to do with rewards and incentives, those sorts of things as well. And it might be also role modeling. It might be, there's lots of techniques you can use to try and shape behavior, particularly, but specifically it's around changing the context of the environment of those behaviors and focusing crucially on the actual behaviors you want to change. And my feeling often with culture change when it comes to bad behaviors is people say this because it's a way of kicking the can down the road. So
Mm.
let's say you're aware of bullying behavior, other kinds of things. I think just saying it's the culture is a way of not really tackling it. It's a way of kind of avoiding it and creating a lot of kind of confusion around it and not say, no, come on, what are these behaviors? Who is engaged in these behaviors? Where are they engaged? Why are they? Is it because we selected people badly? It may be nothing to do with the culture. It may be your selection process, maybe like in the Metropolitan Police, is absolutely awful. And you keep recruiting people who are just going to behave like that. So it's not the culture, it's just the way you selected people. But the key thing always is to start with the specific behaviors.
So I wonder if, notwithstanding your frustration with the term culture, it almost feels like the way that people describe culture is what you perceive as the consequence, the outcome of behaviours. So, for example, often we witness culture when something has been tolerated, bad behaviour has been tolerated
Yeah,
by a person, and so we might perceive, there's a perception of culture, whether it exists or not. There's a perception of culture, and people might go, "There's a toxic culture around here because those managers are allowed to do this, or that
yeah.
person's allowed
They're
to do this."
describing behavior. Yeah.
Got it, got it.
Mhm.
So it's the attitudinal outcome of behaviour and the sort of consequence of that to some extent, in as much as
Yeah.
it exists, you would say.
Yeah, so if we observe behaviours and we think we observe a pattern, which again is still highly questionable, but let's say we think we observe a pattern, then yeah, we tend to sort of call that culture. There's a culture of this in this organisation, there's a culture of this in this bit of the organisation. Yeah, it's a description. So if you want to change something, you don't change the description of it, you change the cause of it. And that's
Got
where
it.
all this other stuff coming. And a good example of kind of some of these, if we move away from the negative behaviours towards sort of more positive behaviours, quite often people are asked to be proactive. Come on, Bruce, you've got to be more proactive. You've got to collaborate more. These are meaningless terms. These are not behaviours. These are just not behaviours. What do you mean by collaborative? What do you mean by proactive? Give me the behaviours. Tell me what they are. Observe them, model them. It doesn't mean anything. So might get, things like 360 appraisals where people got these vague terms in and then no one knows what they mean. Or be innovative. What on earth does that mean? So again, if you want someone to say, it's like saying to your mate who you're trying to encourage, you, oh, come on, you've got to get fit. It's utterly meaningless. If you say, no, let's go to the gym on Tuesday, bang, at 2:00, bang, you've got something. Telling someone they've got to get fit is pointless.
No, we've sort of taken on you've written about engagement. Is it a thing?
Mm,
Psychological safety, is it a thing? Culture, is it a thing? What other topics have you taken on there? I've seen you at one point took on wellness apps, but
mm.
what else have you sort of said? Is this a real thing about?
Yeah. And I would say that in this thing, I'm not debunking them. I like to think of my role. Well, actually, someone told me I'm not a thought leader. I'm a thought provoker. And to go back to the beginning, why? Because I think some of these concepts are not necessarily helpful, and people need to think a bit more about where they are or not. So I'm not trying to debunk. And also because if you debunk, people don't like it. So if you tell someone, Bruce, that their favourite thing is organisational culture, and then you tell them it's not a very useful idea, they don't like it. So I'm not trying to do that in those columns. I'm trying to sort of say, let's think about it a bit more. So other ones we talked about, some of them are more obvious, and I guess that probably are a little more like debunking just because the evidence is so clear. Things like MBTI or personality type indicators and issues around that. They're not really valid psychometric measures. However, in that one, I also pointed out that there's maybe other kinds of validity that people just like it. So people just like using them. So although I may be coming to it and a psychometrician might be coming to it as, is this a good measure of personality? Actually, the users don't really care. And that's kind of okay as long as they're aware they're not measuring personality. There's still questions around the ethics of that. But anyway, that's another one. Learning styles is another fairly kind of straightforward one where there's a reasonable amount of evidence now. And it doesn't seem, A, that people have learning styles to begin with. Their preferences, sure. But if you match someone's preferred way of learning with the way to live the learning, it doesn't seem to make any difference. That's kind of another one. Another classic one is 70% of change initiatives fail.
Yeah.
That's a very common one. Another one is growth mindset. So the idea you can split, you can measure people's their belief in how much they can change and learn, and this again will predict outcomes. And this is a really good example. So growth mindset is used really widely in schools, for example. So anyone listening to this who's got probably kids in primary school, even high school, would probably have come across their kid coming home with something about growth mindset. And what's interesting about that is, A, you've got the problem of defining it, it's not very clear. B, you've got the issue around measuring it, whether it's measured to valid. And the third thing is, some of the biggest kind of meta-analyses that pulled together lots of studies in the educational setting seem to suggest reasonably clearly that it doesn't actually predict much at all about whether people will learn and progress and attain more. So therefore, why have interventions to try and increase this thing called growth mindset, even when it's quite difficult to do, if, as a consequence, it won't actually help attainment very much? So again, it's another really good example. I mean, growth mindset sounds like a great idea, doesn't it? We all want to have a growth mindset. We don't like a fixed mindset, and let's help everyone have a growth mindset. The problem is, maybe it doesn't really matter very much for attainment. So we can try and measure these things, but it's just pretty much a waste of time. And actually going back to the school example, there are probably other things you can do to really help kids learn. That is probably not one of them.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're speaking my language there. I just wonder, though, I mean, one of my favourite podcasts is there's a podcast which sort of disabuses us of all of these things about growth mindset. It's called If Books Could Kill. And it's sort of like
I know it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's quite a gently caustic dismantlement of all of these popular things. And it's brilliant because, especially sort of taking on books that are, I think, disprovable, like Grit by Angela Duckworth. It goes into and really sort of savages the pseudoscience behind them, which in its own way serves to discredit the whole field of psychology when people are sort of putting these things out there.
Sure.
And look, and it extends beyond that. The Jonathan Haidt book is probably one of the most influential books in the last couple of years. The book's about anxious generation, and most of the science in that is disprovable. So it sort of it does damage the field. But I guess
it does.
I guess the question then might be, in that perspective where so much evidence that is presented to us turns out to be untrue, if someone who finds themselves listening to this podcast with the goal of trying to improve their work, trying to make their work better, how would you help them orientate themselves? What would you say to them as a manager, a leader listening to this thinking, I want to make my own work better? I've heard that engagement isn't good. I've heard that we shouldn't just be doing these sort of pulse things. Psychological safety, that I've now put a sort of question mark through it. Growth mindset, I've decided not for this year. What would you advise them with a sort of a slightly more positive perspective that they would set about trying to use to sculpt their own workplace?
Well, I think first I sort of say I don't think it's negative just to say maybe that's not very useful. It can sound negative in an age where everyone has to be very positive about it, but actually it's an incredibly positive thing to say. To say to someone that thing you're doing probably isn't really helping, maybe you should think about it another way. That's fantastically positive. I know it doesn't sound like that, and it's framed because of this positivity bias we have, but it isn't. But what I'll suggest is it's a bit like if someone is surrounded by a box of tools, and they said, well, I tried a hammer, that wasn't really good. Then I tried a pair of pliers, that wasn't great. I used a screwdriver. Yeah, mate, what you say to them, you say, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to do? Forget the tools. Just put them aside Put all these solutions, grit, psychological safety, whatever, put them to one side and think about what you're trying to do. And I think that is the key starting point. And in the case of organizations and businesses, what is the business trying to do? What is the business trying to achieve? And how can you as a manager help the business achieve those things? So firstly, you need to know what the business's objectives are. Don't just assume, find out what they are, or hopefully someone would have cascaded those to you. Think about your role and think, what can I do to help the organization achieve those objectives? And be very clear about understanding what the issues are before you do anything around thinking about solution. So I would say the key thing is to not get distracted by all these shiny objects and think, come on, let's go back to basic. And the problem I think with that is it sounds really boring. That's the problem. It's not exciting. It is actually, going back a sense to what are the issues you're trying to deal with. It's not about finding a best-selling book. It's not about having an inspirational TED Talk person telling you about a great thing with wonderfully inspiring stories. Sorry, it's a bit dull, but it's about trying to do what works given what you're trying to do. So I think that's a really important starting point. And I would say all those things you mentioned, I think typically are just distractions from helping the organization be successful. There may be circumstances, absolutely, where you go through that whole process, you identify, you understand the issues really well, you understand what you're trying to do, you look at a range of options and solutions, you look in this toolbox, and it may turn out, yeah, you do actually need a screwdriver. But it may also turn out you don't need any of those things, you need something completely different. So again, it's about saying, what is the issue? And then once that's understood, what can we do about it?
Is the villain here scale? Because what you sort of described to me is that if I had a manager running a team of 6 people, 10 people, their issue is going to have a specificity to it. It's going to be involved in. It's going to be very precise. And the problem is when organizations scale to 100 to 200 to 1,000 to 10,000, there's an attempt to try to bring a consistent holistic solution. And that's where conversations of scale come in. And you're exactly right. When you attempt to measure culture across 1,000 people, there's no consistency about what people perceive the values to be, what people perceive the incentives to be. So is to some extent, if the actual enemy here is scale, that you're trying to say the problem for our whole organization is screwdrivers, when actually there's going to be someone who needs a saw, someone who needs that actually the solution should be potentially gifting some degree of agency to everyone in every situation, and removing this sort of disempowered scale, and trying to allow people to use their own initiative and is that what we should be thinking about then?
Yeah, I haven't actually thought about that before, but I think that is one of the main barriers here, in that within a small organization, small team, people can see what's going on often much better, and there's a lot more nuance. Whereas if you scale up, you kind of lose that a bit. So I think that's absolutely right. And I think the problem is that people try to impose from the top a kind of solution to problems they don't even know exist, or maybe exist a little bit in some context within the business, which just is going to be irrelevant and not work and even harmful to the rest of the business. So certainly in most of the work I'm doing at the moment, it's very much exactly to your point, saying be specific. So it's a bit like saying a business leader might say, we want everyone to be proactive and entrepreneurial. No, you don't. No. You can't even define it. You can't say what the behaviours are. And maybe, why does everyone need to do that? Maybe some people do. So to your point, it's a really good example of where you've got scale. Some leader perceives we're not entrepreneurial, proactive enough. What they mean is, I have seen some people in some settings, in some parts of the business, where if they behaved in that way, I think it would really help. Fantastic. Do that. Don't do this. We all need to be entrepreneurial and proactive. Because most people are going to scratch their heads and say, I just don't know what you're talking about. Why is that relevant to me? Quite rightly. So maybe that is an issue. It's about trying to impose from the top, as you say, scaling up solution that might be really helpful here to everyone and everything. I think that is a major barrier, actually.
Yeah, quite often when you see some of the challenges that organisations have, I think, firstly, I think of the United Airlines flight 3411, which was a few years ago, flying out of Chicago to Louisville on a Sunday night, and it hit the news, it hit people's social media feeds because one passenger was dragged off the flight, ended up suing the airline. made $140 million in a settlement. But the issue when they did a post-mortem on it was that there was not a single person on the flight who was able to increase the amount of um, commission incentive to get passengers off. And so because they had no one who was empowered to make a decision, there was no agency
Yeah.
there at all. They dragged someone off with sort of catastrophic consequences. And quite often that's sort of a parable for modern work for a lot of people. They're just not allowed to make decisions. And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
you've got this sort of environment where someone comes along and says the new culture is ... and it's a
Yeah.
vague and irrelevant term for you, but trying to do anything at scale ends up producing an answer to something that isn't there.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's it for me.
Absolutely. That's really good. And also, yeah, we want employees to think critically. We want managers to think critically. And it's, a great example of this is so-called resistance to change. And most times I've seen this, and my understanding of it is most times people have resistance to change. It's because they have genuine and, if you like, well-founded objections to what is being proposed. They have a view about why it not work. Organizations may say that as a negative thing. Oh, don't resist change. But actually, they can see what might be going wrong with this. And I think often it is that level of the individual or a small team where you want people to push back, to think critically, to wonder whether what they're being told to do is useful or not. If people just, as it were, follow orders and just do, oh, we're now having this culture, then it's very difficult, I think, for a business to apply intervention solutions that are actually going to be effective. And I think, I think a lot of people feel they can't object to things. And I think going back to psychological safety, I don't even think it's about that. It's just about, oh, we just have to do this because, head officers say we have to do it. So we just need to get on with it. And it's back to your point about rewards, is often people are rewarded for getting stuff done. And this is one of the most depressing things I think around organizations in general, this whole concept of deliverables and targets and outputs. All that sounds marvelous. But the problem is if you reward people for that, that's what people will tend to do, rather than say, I don't agree with this deliverable, I don't agree with this output, I don't think it's going to work, whatever the objection might be. They just say, well, you just have to do it, get on with it. So I think that's again, in some of the stuff I've done, I think I'm trying to get away from the idea of outputs and targets and that sense of performance, more towards trying to facilitate and encourage behaviours that will lead to those outcomes you want. Because by the time you get the outcome, it's too late. It's a bit like, I don't like sports analogies, but it's a bit like a sports analogy where you might say, my team performed really well, but they lost. And what you mean by that is they were engaging in all the kinds of behaviours that should have led to success and the outcome you wanted, but it didn't quite work. And I think we should be focusing much more on helping and supporting people engage in the behaviours that you think will lead to the outcomes, rather than just looking at the outcomes themselves as a kind of guide to how well people are performing. Because often it's not. Sales team that gets terrible leads, a sales team that's trying to sell a duff product, judging them by their performance by the outcome just doesn't make any sense.
I wonder if you could help us. There's a couple more things I want to ask, and one of them
Sure.
is sort of helping people navigate their way out of this. So you've marked our card to say that beware of some of these things that sort of seem simplistic and maybe sort of thing that you see marketed to you in a book. I guess the new and emergent danger is that someone who maybe in the past had found themselves picking up a book thinking, I'm going to try and apply this to my team, now might find themselves going to AI and saying, how could I solve this? And the AI gives them a pretty articulate description of what they need to set about doing, presumably drawing on the same flawed
Yes.
evidence that we've had before.
Yeah.
So what would you do? So someone's taken your advice. They've decided specifically what they're trying to do. They've specifically sort of sat there and defined their problem, defined the challenge. They've got a small team. What's their next step from your perspective? Because the challenge is quite often that people now might have brought some precision to the problem they're facing.
Yeah.
They don't know where to go next. Where do
Yeah.
I go next? What would you advise them? What would they do next?
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question. I think to understand the issue is one thing, and then thinking what can we do about it is the second stage of this evidence-based process. And again, I would really encourage people to have more confidence in their ability to sort of work it out for themselves.
Right.
So what I mean by that is quite often my sense is people do have a good understanding of what might be effective. But what it means is rather than just saying, oh, I need a solution, most of the problems we're dealing with, there aren't solutions. Solution implies there's a thing you can do that will fix it. There isn't. There's multiple things you can do. We're not solving a maths problem or an algebra thing. There isn't an answer. There are no answers. There are lots of things we can do. Each of them will have costs and benefits and maybe have no effect. So I think that second stage of what can we do about it is thinking what are the different options we could have. We maybe could do this. Go back to the Metropolitan Police example. It could be a selection problem. Okay, that's one potential solution. It could be a leadership problem. Maybe that's the other thing. It could be a blah blah problem. Whatever it is, look at those potential interventions and actually try and understand which ones do you think are more likely to work,
Right.
and actually put them, actually compare them. So again, a really important thing in general decision making processes is never just looking at one intervention and saying, is that going to work? That's a big mistake. You always have to have like at least 3 or 4 different things you think you could do and start to actually compare them. And it may turn out the two are equally, you think equally out, and that's fine, toss a coin. But I mean, I think that second stage is really thinking what are the different things we could do. I would say, generally speaking, when you're thinking about solutions, looking at a best-selling book uh, is, I think it's highly unlikely that's where the solution's going to lie. It may be, absolutely, but it seems to be very unlikely that one idea that someone has promoted the hell out of, often using dodgy data or exaggerated data or partial data. I just can't see that. It could be, but it seems quite unlikely as opposed to think about other kinds of intervention, other kinds of solutions. So I would really encourage people to sort of think it through for themselves. And back to the beginning where being skeptical or cynical, in that sense, I'm not at all cynical. I think people can work out more stuff themselves, but they go over time in all kinds of ways. And for a better word, they're being slightly disempowered to feel they can do that. They're being a bit beaten down by, look, this is what Google's doing. This is what this best-selling book does. I saw this guru. I have to do those things because they're the smart people and I should do. No, they're not. You're the smart person. You can work it out. But it does require critical thinking and it does require using data and evidence of different kinds.
I got it. So it's sort of advocating for trusting yourself, building experience, sort of learning on the job, pushing back against the TikTokification of advice, really. Like if you see something in a sort of 90-minute clip, it's probably by 90-second. If you see something in a 90-second clip, almost by its very nature, it's too simplistic to be meaningful, to be
Yeah,
universally
yeah.
applied.
Yeah, I think so. As I mentioned before, this sense that if you instantly get an idea, which is supposed to be very complicated, almost certainly that idea is wrong because it went straight into some cognitive bias and made you feel good. And, oh, I understand, that's fantastic. And you liked it. So what if you liked it? We're not trying to do things we like. We're trying to do things we think are effective and work and will help. And I think your other point is it's a bit about reflecting. You're right. A lot of it is about experience and craft, but it's also particularly around what evidence-based approach. It's about being explicit in sharing and collectively thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it, and sharing that evidence and that data you're using to both understand the problem and think about what you can do about it. I think that sharing of it is also a really important part of the learning as well.
Rob, you've mentioned the corporate research forum. Quite often when you post stuff, you put links to stuff that you're working on, or you seem to
Yeah,
be, from the outside, you seem to be sort of building a movement of people who are interested in this stuff. I wonder if you could give us a pointer of where people might go next. What would people, if they're interested in your
sure.
perspective here, what would people find
Yeah.
themselves doing next?
So if you go on the Corporate Research Forum website itself, you can get access to some reports, including ones about things like changing employee attitudes, whether they're changing or not, things about evidence-based HR, things about how HR can drive organizational performance. There's other kinds of reports there, but also as a sort of subsection of that website, there's something called the Work Psychology Network, which we set up a couple of years ago. And if you go on there, you'll find access to quite a lot of reports and overviews and videos. I can give you some for the show notes as well, where you can actually look at some of the work psychology theory and evidence we pulled together to try and help managers and HR people. And this is based on, and this links to what you're interested in as well. I know, Bruce, but it's based on the assumption that often what HR and managers are trying to do is they're trying to shape behavior. They're trying to shape employee behavior, whether it's through training or incentives or punishments or rewards or the way you select people. You're trying to shape behavior. The challenge is as far as I can see, most managers and HR people have almost no access to the underlying scientific theory and evidence around how you change behavior at work. So that's why we set up the Work Psychology Network, is to write reports that are very accessible, but still critical of the work psychology stuff, but also give people frameworks they can use for thinking about these things a bit more. Because the problem is now, it's really hard to get access to that. So what do? You get access to the best-selling book or the 90-second TikTok clip. You get access to the stuff it's easiest to get access to. Getting hold of scientific evidence, as you know, is quite tricky. So what we try to do these reports is kind of summarize it in a way that's quite kind of accessible. So I think there's those two things. There's the general CRF website, and also there's the Work Psychology Network, which is trying to really give people, say, sort of educate them, train them into that underlying science that should underlie what you're doing when you're trying to change behavior at work.
Love it. Well, I've linked to those in the show notes. I'm so immensely grateful. I think, there's a lot of people who, if people have listened this far, then they've probably had something that they took to believe challenged, and it's forced a reappraisal for them. And I think that's almost certainly the most positive thing that they can do. That sometimes shaking yourself out of a really simple belief that you've had is a good way to provoke yourself and to sort of actually expand your understanding.
I think it is, and I think it's also really crucial that people, once they feel that idea they loved isn't maybe very useful, the key thing is not to just jump on the next popular idea that seems really appealing. It's almost to say, I'm going to, get onto a better diet of theory and evidence and knowledge, rather than a lot of this stuff which probably isn't very sound. Because the temptation, people often say to me, what's the alternative to engagement? What's the alternative to psychological safety? Well, there isn't one. It doesn't work like that. It's not about that. It's about saying, what's the issue and what can you do about it? So yeah, absolutely questioning some of these ideas you hold to be true is always important, but equally it's not jumping on to the next thing you think is cool.
I love it. I loved that discussion. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking so long out of your day to do it. I'm immensely grateful.
Thank you.